So, in case you guys somehow missed it, over the course of this week, I've talked about a couple of different non-anime magical girl shows that I was exposed to when I was younger. The point of those videos was to re-explore some nostalgic properties from my past, of course. That's something that the My Two Cents series does a lot. But also to build foundations for comparison to another show that I wanted to talk about. That being the recent Netflix reinterpretation / adaptation of the one of those shows that I talked about most recently, Winx Club. That means that today we're talking about Fate, the Winx Saga. Obviously you knew that, it's in the title of the video, but you know, I have to set this up somehow. And I've got notes here. I've got my notes right here. I'm really struggling to actually decide how I would open this video, though. I guess the best place to start is with the premise of Winx itself. Something that actually one of you guys pointed out, you must be on Tumblr about it. Something you guys pointed out was missing from my discussion about Winx was the general premise of Winx. Like I spoke from a place of knowing what it is, but I didn't actually go over what it is. And that's because I didn't want to repeat myself when I talked about it here. The main premise of Winx is that Bloom, a character who her entire life thought she was a regular human, one day discovers that she has magical powers. It's a Harry Potter-esque kind of situation. She comes from a mundane world where she lives a mundane life. But the discovery of these magical powers whisks her off to another world where she gets to learn about them and grow as a person as a result. She discovers that she's a fairy, and she makes friends with other characters who are also fairies going to this fairy school to learn more about how to use their fairy magic in a world where magic is the foundation of everything. And while there is a plot, it's kind of a Chosen One-esque plot. Bloom does have something of a Chosen One style destiny. The story is punctuated with lots of slice of life relationship stuff, like relationship stuff between her and her friends, and like actual romantic relationship stuff. And there are enemies to fight, and there's like dark plots and stuff, but they're not too much of the focus of things. The focus of things is on the everyday interactions of these characters. And I wanted to wait to go over the main premise of Winx until this video, specifically so that you guys would have that premise fresh in your minds, because I don't like to repeat myself. So you have it fresh in your minds from me having just told you what it is, so that you will feel the full effect of what I'm about to say next. And that is that on paper, all of those elements are here. And yet, this is still a really bad Winx show. And now I do want to clarify something and admit to something, actually, that is probably going to cause some of you guys to lose a little bit of respect for me. I kind of like this show. Like, there's definitely stuff about it that I feel definitely shouldn't be here, just in general. But looking at it as just a show, and not as an adaptation of an existing work, I kind of dig it. In the same kind of way that I dig any kind of show that I can turn my brain off and just watch. Like, there's definitely stuff in here that's stupid. There are some very blatant plot contradictions. I'm not going to get into too much of the specific plot of this show. I have watched the whole season at this point, but I'm not going to get too into the specific plot of this show. But there's definitely some really stupid stuff here. Stuff that doesn't make sense. Stuff that's just here to be like a twist reveal or an intrigue hook, because the show needs an intrigue hook right here at this point in this one episode to keep people watching, right? But I do kind of like it as just a generic Harry Potter clone. It's perfectly fine. And there are some things about it that I genuinely do like. And keeping all of that in mind, I want to reiterate, this is a really bad Winx show. Because you can make any two things that are even remotely similar seem practically identical if you summarize them in just the right ways. If you break down their premises into the bare bones with just the right phrasing. And I pulled that trick a little bit here. Because while all of those things, all of those core premise things about Winx are technically here, and they even kind of replicate some of the plot beats of the first story arc of Winx too, I guess, technically. The spirit of Winx is completely missing from this show. And you guys can just trust me on that and go into any potential future watches of this show that you might have planned, bearing that in mind, and skip the rest of this review if you want. Because for the most part, this review is just going to be me whinging about a few specific things and lamenting what I feel is some major lost potential, major wasted potential. Because as I said in my 2 cents on Winx itself, I feel like Winx is a property which has so much potential for a modern reboot. A really good modern reboot that remains true to what Winx is. And there are glimmers of that. There are glimmers of that here. And that's probably why you will encounter Winx fans who like this show as a Winx show. They see those things in it and are more forgiving of the other stuff. But I stand by what I said. This is fundamentally a bad Winx show. It's a perfectly fine to maybe even good, depending on your tastes, general show. But it is a bad Winx show. And I would argue it's not even a Winx show to begin with. But first, let's get some of that whinging that I alluded to out of the way before I delve more deeply into specific things that I feel this show could have done better. This is probably something a lot of you guys don't care to hear about. It's a topic that is talked about a lot, and people either tend to have already heard about it or find the whole thing annoying. But I have to talk about whitewashing. And I'll say right out the gate, it's not something that bothers me a ton, because there are some things that are said to be whitewashing that I just don't agree are. Like for example, the recent movie adaptation of Battle Angel Alita, an old manga, was said to be whitewashed because the characters in it were not primarily Asian, but I didn't see a problem with that in the case of that specific movie, because it was just wholesale transplanted to a completely different setting than what was in the manga. It still resembled the setting of the manga, but like geographically speaking, it was a different setting, so it had a different, diverse cast of people in it than what you would have seen from a comparatively one-to-one adaptation. Something like that I don't have a problem with. But then there's stuff like another adaptation of a manga, the also pretty recent movie adaptation of Ghost in the Shell, where they cast Scarlett Johansson as the lead character in an incredibly Japanese work. Like, the Japanese-ness of Ghost in the Shell is integral to the themes of that story. And on paper, it doesn't feel like recasting the lead of that particular work as a white woman should be an issue, because like the whole thing about that character in the source material is that she can literally look like anybody. It doesn't matter. Her appearance is a complete non-issue. But the whitewashing in that movie didn't stop with that character. The entire plot and all of its themes were comparatively whitewashed, and it ruined something that was great about the original work. That's when I have a problem with whitewashing. And while I'll admit that the whitewashing in this isn't as egregious as that, it doesn't like ruin the story's themes or anything. One of the best things about Winx as work was that the main cast was diverse. You had black characters, you had a character who was coded as, I read her as Japanese, I read Musa as Japanese, right? A character who was coded as Latina, and just in general, There were diverse-looking people everywhere in the expanded cast of this show, in the backgrounds. It felt like a very alive and diverse world. And that was a big part of its appeal for a lot of people. There were a lot of people who watched this show, and they saw people in it who looked like them in a time where that kind of diversity wasn't quite a thing yet in television. And yet here, in this show, Musa's played by a character who I do believe is part Asian, but no offense to her, and this might come off as insensitive, she definitely doesn't look it. And the character of Flora, the character who was coded as Latina, isn't even here. Like she's mentioned offhandedly, potentially, as the cousin of the character who comes in here to replace her. A character named Torre, who is a heavier girl, which, like, I'm all for characters with diverse body types showing up in shows like this too. But, like, why replace the character to do that? Couldn't Flora have been a heavier girl too? What would have been wrong with that? It just feels like something which made the show great in a way that wasn't really drawn attention to in the original. It was just part of the original. An offhanded part of the original is just missing here. And everything feels kind of wrong as a result. Coupled with the fact that my personal favorite character out of the original cast of 5, Tecna, just flat out isn't here at all, which speaks to a larger problem with the everything about this show as an adaptation. And you start to wonder why this show is a Winx show in the first place. If the dynamic of the group is going to be so radically different, then what is the point of making this show as an adaptation of Winx in the first place? Because the main point of Winx as a franchise was the relationship between these girls. Like, Winx was still primarily an episodic early 2000s after-school cartoon, right? So the character relationships weren't super deep or explored in too much detail, but they definitely felt real and comprehensive, like bonds that would last a lifetime. And one of the things I do like about this show is that you can tell that the main cast are undergoing an arc towards being that from like the first couple episodes of the show. And you can tell the direction in which these relationship dynamics are going to go. And I do like how they're realized. I do like that these characters take time to warm up to each other. It makes the relationships feel more real, like they have some real payoff behind them. But fundamentally, these characters barely resemble their counterparts from the show. So I don't feel like we're exploring a more realistic, probably isn't the best word, a more grounded version of these characters coming together and becoming lifelong friends. I feel like we're seeing an entirely different group of completely unrelated characters coming together and growing into lifelong friends. Like, the appeal of watching a Winx show where these characters have to grow over time into friends, rather than just kind of being friendly from the beginning, is seeing those characters have to grow into being friends. And that's not what this is. I will say I don't mind them bringing in Aisha to replace Tecna here, though, if they were going to replace her with anybody. Though personally I would have preferred Roxy. I like Roxy a little better. But she was never like 100% part of the core group, right? Can you tell I've watched more of the show since my last video? But still it works, because one of the themes of this is that this version of Bloom can't control her fire powers. And so bringing in the Fairy of Water, who can counteract those powers when they go out of control, is a nice idea. But the absence of Tecna, as I hinted before, speaks to something else that's absent from this version of the show. If you recall, in my 2 cents on Winx, the original, I mentioned that in a show where the animation was kind of cheap looking and corner cutty, at the very least, the world was super interesting. It felt like a modern, lived-in world where magic just happened to be commonplace. Magic was the foundation of everything, and they had been able to unlock more advanced technology than what we have on Earth, because their technology was powered by magic. Technology in the greater realms of Winx is in and of itself a kind of magic, and that was Techna's thing. And so it's pretty obvious why she's not here. And that's because that cool tech isn't here. They would have to change her so radically that she wouldn't even feel like herself. Like, even more so than these other characters don't feel like themselves. And like, they did the same thing with Musa. And she's a mind fairy, I think is what they called her, or a thought fairy or something. She's an empath, basically, in this. She's not a fairy whose magic is music. And she uses music to cut herself off from other people so she doesn't feel their emotions as strongly, which would be a cool way to say something about, like, a neurodivergent person coping with, like, overstimulation or something. But they never really get too much into it, as far as I recall, anyway. So it falls kind of flat. Point is, they changed her just as radically as they would have had to have changed Techna. But Techna being here and changed so radically would have brought attention to the absence of all of that super tech. And Musa doesn't draw attention to something else ancillary to herself just by being here, if that makes sense. And I already said, a more serious reboot of Winx could work. I believe that 100%. Something like She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, for example. The great thing about She-Ra, and why it works as a She-Ra reboot specifically, is that it's still set in a bright, colorful world, just like the original. The characters are still recognizable as the characters from that. They're just, given more personality and given arcs of their own, right? But more importantly, the themes of the original, things that were kind of ancillary to what actually happened in the show, things that were implied but never really shown, were fully explored and dissected in the She-Ra reboot. What are the actual consequences and implications of an ancient war? What if your chosen one hero character isn't just some perfect, unbeatable badass? What if she has a hero complex, which, while it does real good for the people around her, is harmful to herself, and she has to learn to value herself in order to truly find herself and find her balance and forge a more healthy way forward for herself in the future. She had to acknowledge her own value alongside the value of everyone else that she was fighting for before she could truly be happy. Stuff like that is explored by the She-Ra reboot, and it's stuff that grows organically from the themes and dynamics and the setting of the original. And a version of Winx that does that explores things like how difficult it can be to actually work towards your dreams, how disheartening a setback can be, because Winx has all these big reach for your dreams undertones, right? It could explore how it feels to be separated from the life you once knew, to be thrown wholesale into an entirely new environment, like going off to college, which at its barest bones is what Winx is about, just through the lens of a magical techno-fantasy world. It could recast the antagonists of the original as symbolic hurdles for these characters to overcome as they grow. But this show doesn't do that. This show is interesting. It has real intrigue to it. There's definitely some elements to it that feel very gratuitous. I didn't like the burned ones, or whatever they were called, as villains in this at all. I thought they were just stupid. They're basically just magical zombies. And like, some interesting stuff is done with them, I guess, but I found them very uninteresting. And also there's just so much gratuitous violence and sexual content in this that, while I don't begrudge those things in and of themselves, they felt particularly out of place in a show where the characters are named after characters from Winx. It just took me out of the narrative every time they showed up, those elements. I detested them a lot. But there are real merits to this show. It's not a Winx show. It doesn't take the themes of Winx and explore them in a new, different, and or more comprehensive way. It just paints a vaguely Winxish veneer over a different show and calls it a day. And like, there are certainly areas where you can tell that they tried, that they thought they were going to be able to adapt this concept into a Winx show. And that's what they were trying to do. That they were trying to make a Winx show that Winx fans would love. But then they just missed the point. Like the character of Stella, who's not my favorite of the cast in the cartoon. I find her kind of grating sometimes. But man, I hated her in this. She is so not Stella that it's baffling. Stella in the original is bombastic and pushy, and she likes to be the center of attention, and she's kind of a troublemaker. And you can definitely feel some self-importance there. But she's still nice, and she owns up to her mistakes. When she makes real mistakes, she owns up to them. Stella in this, though, was manipulative. Like, even when every once in a while it would seem like she was finally being not manipulative, she was still being manipulative. Like, you can tell she's got some genuine insecurities. Like, very early on, maybe even like the first episode, I don't remember, she mentions how she'd much rather just be back at home, living a comparatively mundane life, similar to the life that Bloom came from, perhaps. Which is an interesting parallel, but again, they don't really do a ton with it. And so, if she were still some version of cartoon Stella, and they portrayed all of that bombastic behavior as a facade to protect herself from feeling all of that, from feeling all that insecurity, it could have worked. It could have been great. But instead, she's just this unlikable, manipulative, kind of bad person. And like, she develops over the course of the season, but not once, well, a couple of times, but hardly ever did I find her even remotely likable here. They just missed the mark so hard, and I can't think of a better example to truly demonstrate that than to cite a behind-the-scenes short featurette that I watched on, I think, the UK Netflix YouTube channel, where they talked about the one magical girl transformation that we got in this season of the show. Spoiler alert for this show, Bloom does undergo a magical girl transformation at one point. She unlocks her wings and she gets cool fire wings. It actually looked pretty good. But first of all, she's the only person who transforms. Transformation is not a thing in this version of Winx until she rediscovers it by the end of the season. Transformation magic has been lost. Which, in and of itself, is missing the point. This is a magical girl show. But then, in that behind-the-scenes featurette, I don't know who the guy was. I don't know if he was like the showrunner or a director or a producer or what. But there's a dude in the video talking about how early on they decided that the transformations in this show would not come with costume changes.
Early on, we made a decision that there would be no costume change.
It's a magical girl transformation. The point of the magical girl transformation is a costume change. That's what it is. I can't... They missed the point so hard that I can't even form a coherent sentence while thinking about it. And that's really what this show is. It had the potential to be really great, and every once in a while you can see the glimmer of that greatness. Like, the character who replaces Flora in this, Tara, is a pretty cool character. I actually like her a lot. I could see a lot of her character moments, appropriately modified, of course, being transplanted into an actual good adaptation of Winx, reboot of Winx, and really working for somebody's character development. And they are one of the highlights of this show as it exists. But because this show is so inherently un-Winxish, it doesn't elevate the show magically into a better reboot of Winx, a better adaptation of Winx. It's just, oh hey, the show did a good thing while completely missing the point of what it was supposed to be. And maybe with a couple more passes, they could have gotten this show to a point where it actually worked as a Winx show, even while being pretty different. Like, I could see that being a thing that might have happened if they had, you know, done that. But as it stands, regardless of how good it is as a show, in and of itself, it is a bad Winx show. And I didn't even get into stuff like the fact that it's darker. Like, lighting-wise, it's darker than Winx ever was. And boring looking and generic. Like, the specialists are in here. Specialists are something I haven't even talked about yet. In the original, they use these cool, like, Magitech weapons. In this, they just have, like, swords and shit. And it looks cool. Like, when they do fight stuff, it looks cool. But they're not the specialists. They fundamentally do not resemble the specialists. Some of them resemble individual specialist characters, but the group as a whole does not resemble the specialists. Though I do like that there were girl specialists in this. I don't think there were in the original. I thought that was actually kind of a nice touch. And likewise, while lip service is paid to there being other worlds, other realms, where things aren't this, the school itself is just some generic, practically entirely non-magical looking school in the middle of the woods. Like, it's behind a barrier to keep those aforementioned burned ones out. And you do see characters do magic sometimes while they're there, but you can do magic in other places. Like, I think the implication is supposed to be that the, like, magical societies with Magitech and stuff are supposed to exist in those other locations that we just conveniently don't see. But for whatever reason, even though there is technology here, people have technology here, we don't see any of that here. And the building's dreary and boring looking. And magic isn't something that's done semi-casually like it is in the show. It's not a core part of people's lives and how they interact. Like I like that the show explores how dangerous magic can be, and I could definitely see a version of Winx exploring that, but not in the way they do it here. Here, Bloom is only here because her magic went out of control back on Earth, and she has to be here to learn to control it. Like they don't come right out and say that she wouldn't be here if not for that, but that's definitely the implication. And like sure, explore how magic can be dangerous, especially fire magic. Fire is dangerous. But don't do it in a way that takes away the wonder of the magic. That makes Bloom being here to experience the wonder of her magic. The magic being symbolic of, like, her potential, right? Her, like, potential to grow into the person she believes she can be, right? Don't do that in a way that strips it of that wonder. Because forcing her to be here, making it an obligation, something that she feels she has to do, strips it of that. It makes it something so much less interesting. Unless, I guess, the point was to parallel that fear to Bloom's fear of revealing her true self, upending or ruining her life in some way. Like, maybe they were trying to like it to like a coming out or something. But considering the everything else about this, the context around this, it'd be pretty problematic if that's what their intention was, considering that she literally went off to a school somewhere, an institution somewhere, to learn to control that part of herself so that she wouldn't harm others with it. And even though the transformation towards the end of the show could be considered symbolic of her embracing her true self and being stronger for it, her transforming is still linked directly to her learning to control that aspect of herself so that it doesn't harm the people around her. So it doesn't work as a metaphor for coming out, because being your authentic self doesn't harm people unless they're bad people, which is on them, not you. And if that was the intention, I just don't see it anywhere else. Like, Bloom's discovery of her powers doesn't come along with her, like, having a crush on another girl or something, for example. And there's even a romantic relationship being built up between her and a guy in this movie, which, I mean, it's not impossible for a girl to like a guy and be LGBT, right? But it seems a little counterintuitive, if that is what they're going for, that they would do that. Which, I'm only bringing this up because, like, I've seen people online, just one or two, but I've seen people online bring this up as one of the themes of the show. And while I do think that could work, I definitely think that could work, it doesn't work here, and just flat doesn't make sense. And that's really the most simple way that I could sum up what's wrong with this show as a Winx show. There are interesting things about it, but everything that resembles Winx in this show is so much less interesting than in the original, or especially what it could have been. Like, I know some of you guys have seen it, but not all of you have seen it. I finally updated my channel trailer recently, and in that, I say, I hate wasted potential. And man, this show has so much of that. It's baffling. Like I said earlier, though, there are fans of Winx who like this show as a Winx show. It's hard to tell how high a percentage of the fandom they make up, but they definitely exist. So if you are a fan of the original, I still think you should give this a shot. And if you're not, and you somehow still manage to sit through this entire way longer than I intended it to be video, despite that, I think you should probably check it out too. Like, it's not the kind of show that I think you should take too seriously. It's turn off your brain popcorn television, and its premises are kind of generic at this point. But there is still a lot to like here. If this show were not a Winx show, if they had just made a similar show with their own characters and locations and world with basically this exact same premise, I think it would have been perfectly fine. The Winxness of this show is not integral to this show. It could be removed and this show would be mostly the same. And I certainly think that despite the fact that I did enjoy a lot of stuff about this, I would have enjoyed it significantly more if that had been the case. But that's been my 2 cents on this topic. Again, this one's much longer than I planned for it to be. I really apologize for that. I went off on a couple of tangents there. I don't know if you could tell. But as per usual, I'd love to know what you guys think of this one. And let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video and share it with anyone else you think might enjoy my content. Subscribe if you haven't. I'm really trying to get myself out there, and I'd really appreciate it if you guys can help. You can also check out my social medias. Links to those will be in the video description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.